All right. So there, I think we now have everything set up, and I will go ahead and jump right in. Um, I I'll just say this will probably be the last week, the second to last week that we concentrate on this set of lectures that have to do with abortion, but also with gender, sexuality, polarization, and the courts, and that the news has very much cooperated in keeping this set of topics relevant and current. The last week when we were discussing these issues, we had seen Florida, despite the fact that its constitutional provision protecting privacy was put in place only in 1980, that is to say, 7 years after Roe v. Wade had declared that the right to abortion was protected as part of the right to privacy. The Florida Supreme Court held that the Florida Constitution, under its privacy provision, did not protect the right to abortion. And so within a few weeks now, Florida will have a 6-week abortion ban. And for most intents and purposes, that means a fairly total abortion ban. And then this week, we see what's happening in Arizona, especially with the state Supreme Court again, declaring that a 1864 law criminalizing all but medically necessary abortions, right? So a law that dates back 160 years, long before Arizona was a state, nevertheless has effect and will take effect again next month. And so two basically near total abortion bans in two pretty critical states. Arizona has been a swing state, a battleground state for the last 3 presidential elections. Florida has been more solidly Republican, but there's a question about whether or not this recent Florida Supreme Court decision will perhaps put Florida back into electoral competition for the Democrats. And then a little bit perhaps less noticed, but one of the liberal justices in the Wisconsin Supreme Court indicated that they would retire in time for an election to be held on filling their seat for the 2024 presidential election. The liberals on the Wisconsin Supreme Court currently have a 1-person majority. That's been extremely important to things to do with electoral districting, but also important for abortion rights in Wisconsin. And so again, the issue of abortion appears to be front and center in the politics of another swing state. So my suggestion to you, and I think I've gotten a little bit more clarity in the way to formulate this issue with regards to abortion as we've been speaking about it over the last few weeks. And so let me put it this way, that for the last, and it's roughly 50 years, it goes back to 1976 when Ronald Reagan first put a pro-life or anti-abortion plank into the Republican platform, and then especially in 1980 when Ronald Reagan became the nominee for the party and then was elected president, the idea of the Republican Party as a pro-life anti-abortion party has increasingly taken hold. And we see this in all kinds of polling data leading up to the Dobbs decision. But having said that, what we're seeing in the polling data after the Dobbs decision is also quite striking and suggests a hypothesis. Let me venture the hypothesis with you. Prior to Dobbs, the majority of Republicans reported being pro-life. That's no surprise. It's a strong majority, actually. After Dobbs, 43% of Republicans report being pro-choice, roughly the same number as report being pro-life. How do we reconcile these two polling results? And I will suggest the hypothesis, which I will readily confess is speculative, but I think it really helps to set up what we need to talk through to finish our discussion of this issue. Here is the hypothesis, which is that beginning in 1976, taking hold in 1980, the Republican Party became identified as a pro-life party that brought into the Republican fold a number of voters who were highly mobilized single issue voters on abortion, or who put abortion at the top or close to the top of the issues that they cared most about. Those are evangelical voters, some Catholic voters, some traditional, very conservative voters who see abortion as symbolic of traditional gender relations. And those voters really did care about this issue and put this issue front and center in Republican politics. But there were other Republican voters who were lifelong Republicans, whose parents had been Republicans, or who were Republicans because they embraced the small government, pro business, low regulation, low taxation vision that the Republican Party traditionally represented. And they went along with the pro life identification of the Republican Party, not necessarily because this was what they felt or what they believed or because they were passionate about this issue, but because it was the party's identity and they embraced that identity for other reasons. But please note, for many of these voters, at least in the back of their minds, it was possible to say to themselves, look, I can vote for pro-life candidates, claim to be part of a pro-life party, in fact, be pro-life myself when I answer a poll, but it doesn't matter because who I vote for does not determine access to abortion in the United States because we are a constitutional democracy and we don't get to vote on the issues that the Supreme Court says are constitutionally protected. And since 1973, the right to abortion has been one such issue. In the realm of political philosophy that I study, people speak of one of the functions of a constitution with entrenched rights protected by judicial review. The function that that set of institutions plays is to take political issues off the political agenda. I can say to you with confidence that I will not be persecuted or prosecuted for being frank about what I believe, even when it's controversial, even when it's a minority position, even when the majority is hostile to what I believe, because I live in a society where the right to freedom of protection is constitutionally enshrined and protected by the courts. That issue is off the political agenda. I don't have to worry about it. Well, I think a substantial portion of Republican voters had in the back of their minds the idea that abortion is off the political agenda. And so it doesn't really matter in terms of the sanctity of this right, how I vote. The Supreme Court is an institution that has almost never retracted a right once it's been granted. That would damage its legitimacy, and in particular, it would conflict with the principle of stare decisis, which is a principle that says precedent should be respected because people build their lives in reliance on the stability of the law, especially constitutional law. So I can, with safety, vote for these pro-life candidates, even though in a world in which this was back on the political agenda, I might have to reconsider. And of course, in June of 2022, the Supreme Court did what I believe many people thought would never happen, which is they actually reversed course. They overturned Roe v. Wade. And all of a sudden, in November of 2022, and especially in November of 2024, it is no longer the case that a person who is pro-choice can safely vote for the Republican Party. To put it differently, the Republican Party kind of had its cake and ate it too on this issue. It squared the circle of being able to get a substantial portion of its voters, let's say somewhere between a third and a half, on board because they were pro-life, because they cared deeply about this issue, because they were single issue voters, and they were highly likely to vote if there was a pro-life candidate on the ballot. Very useful to have that in your political coalition without suffering the loss of voters who were less adamantly pro-life, or maybe even deep in their conscience and convictions pro-choice, but able to reconcile themselves voting for pro-life candidates. That coalition is showing serious signs of fracturing. So that's one reason to be talking about abortion in 2024, is that it helps us to see one of the ways in which the Republican Party is no longer able to assemble the same coalition that it has relied on for nearly 50 years. Add to that, then, that there are a number of Democrats who the polling data shows sat on the sidelines in 2020, did not vote for Joe Biden, who are strongly pro-choice, but just like their Republican counterparts, didn't believe that the issue of access to abortion would be decided at the ballot box, thought instead it would be decided by the Supreme Court, had been decided by the Supreme Court, and was off the political agenda. For those voters, now abortion is back on the agenda, and we're seeing in some very conservative states that voters are turning out and voting to try to protect the right to abortion when it is on the ballot. It now looks like it may be on the ballot in Florida, Arizona, Wisconsin in 2024. So as I say, I hope that gives us greater clarity in thinking about how the return of abortion to the active political agenda of American politics is altering the coalition, the political behavior, the calculus of voters and parties in this election. The final piece of news right from this week is, of course, that Donald Trump appears to recognize this and has now given a statement on his Truth social media platform, in which he himself has tried to square the circle on abortion. On the one hand, he wants credit for having appointed the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. He claims that no other president could have done that, right? And on the other hand, he wants to say that now he's done, right? That he won't support further federal legislation to ban abortion in states that continue to approve it, that this is a states' rights issue. Please note, immediately following his statement, Mike Pence, his own vice president, speaking for the pro-life movement, said, this is a slap in the face because, among other things, in ways I can show you, the number of abortions in the United States has gone up since Roe v. Wade was overturned. That doesn't mean that it's gone up because Roe v. Wade was overturned. I think there's some pretty good evidence that the number of abortions has gone down in states where there's less access to abortion. But having said that, it's gone up in other states, perhaps because of COVID, perhaps because of economic circumstances like inflation. But if you are pro life, not just anti Roe v. Wade, then the fact that abortion continues to go up after Roe v. Wade has been overturned means that you want further federal action to restrict abortions. Donald Trump is saying, no, I don't favor that. And I think he's saying it for sound political reasons, which is that this is likely now a losing issue for the Republican Party. More than 3/4 of Americans want a federal right to abortion. That includes 43% of Republicans. And so he worries that he's going to lose those voters over this issue if he remains strongly identified with continuing to roll back access to abortion. And so he's trying to reconcile these two ideas. It seems to me it's very difficult to on the one hand, maintain mobilized support from pro-life voters who think of this as the most important issue for them, while also reassuring voters who are pro-choice that the consequence of continuing to support you won't be that access to abortion will be further restricted. So having said all of that, right, and I hope that lends some clarity as to why it is I think abortion may be not yet fully taken into account in our polls, the way in which our polls are built for an era in which people, although they may have been pro-choice, were not ranking this issue highly enough to even say to pollsters that they were in fact pro-choice. That this is changing the underlying dynamics of this election in ways that are not yet showing up in the polls very well. Having said all of that, I want to be as clear as possible. I'm not going to focus, I haven't focused exclusively on abortion. I think we have to recognize that abortion gets its power as a mobilizing issue for the last 50 years in American politics as a way of talking more generally about relations between the sexes, about gender roles, about the increasing rejection of compulsory heterosexuality in our society, the increasing tolerance and then legality of gay marriage and gay relations, that all of this is extremely challenging to people who continue to maintain traditional religious or ethical or moral outlooks, who value traditional culture as a source of that kind of order, and that the politics around abortion, but more generally around should we embrace the rapid, and it has been very quick, removal of the constraint that biology had up until this point presented for human behavior, the rapid transformation as a result in gender roles and sexual equality, or should we instead try to slow this down or reverse it? And I will try to suggest to you today, as I have over the past couple of weeks, that there is a sharp divide, not just on abortion, but on the underlying question of the legitimacy, the normativity, if you will, of tradition and traditional gender roles in the United States in the 21st century. And it's impossible to think, I believe at least, of this kind of division. We should overthrow tradition because it constrains us, it prohibits equality, it prevents liberty from being available to all, or we should maintain tradition because it gives us valued social roles because there's nothing that is being proposed to replace it. And a society that loses its traditions, loses its cohesiveness, loses its moral foundations, and very quickly ceases to function very well, becomes an unhealthy, uh, dysfunctional, pathological society. And that there's just no way that we could have that debate without it being highly polarizing. So again, I think this helps us to understand a little bit about what's happening in 2024 in our politics, why we're so deeply polarized. I will just quickly point out to you, there's been some updated poll information, and it does show some movement. I don't think we should predict a lot based on what we're seeing in April of 2024 about what's going to happen in November of 2024, other than to recognize that this is currently a very tight race, that a substantial portion of Americans are still refusing to commit to either of these candidates, but that over the last month since the State of the Union address, perhaps since the economy seems to have improved a little bit, perhaps also since various court decisions have called greater attention to abortion, there's been in general a movement in the direction of Joe Biden in these polls. Overall, he's gained about 1.5%. Now, having said that, the other thing I think we should be paying attention to in the polls is the relative enthusiasm for these two candidates. And I think this is quite interesting. This is something Axios prepared. It shows that in general, more voters in primaries that are essentially uncontested primaries, right? That there's nobody really running against Biden, nobody really running against Trump, that there's been this movement to vote, quote, uncommitted in the Democratic primaries as a way of expressing a protest against Joe Biden, often as a result of Biden's support of Israel and Israel's campaign in Gaza, that he has not been getting 100% of the vote. But at the same time, in elections where Donald Trump still faces Nikki Haley on the ballot, even though she has since declared that she's out of the race, we see, in fact, and it's a fairly consistent but not altogether consistent pattern, that Biden is getting more Democratic voters than Trump is getting Republican voters. So that would suggest perhaps there's more of an enthusiasm problem for Trump among Republican voters than there is for Biden among Democratic voters. But then we should also note, right, that among newly registered voters, really for the first time in a long time, the share registering Democratic appears to be shrinking, perhaps even below the share registering Republican, and that for the first time in a long time, it appears there may be roughly equal numbers of registered Democrats and Republicans in the country. All of this to say, this is a very unsettled race. The competition between two candidates, as unpopular as Biden and Trump, I think carries with it a lot of volatility. And we're seeing this in the contemporary polls. All right, with that in mind, let me then pivot back to the abortion issue very quickly. And I'm going to add a little bit of new material that builds on old material that we've already talked about. The idea that over the last 50 years, we've moved from being a society with fairly determinate gender norms and roles, that we know what it means to be a good mother and a wife, and either you conform with those expectations or you will be socially condemned for failing to do so, to being a society with looser expectations, norms, and roles. That for many people, this has been liberating. For some people, this feels like social disintegration, and it's normatively threatening. That given the leading role that the courts have played in bringing about this transition, for those who are threatened by this transition, the idea of changing the court, and in particular focusing on abortion, has been critical to their politics. That this has led, among other things, to a desire for greater authority on the part of the government, and for leaders who are willing to use that authority to slow down the rate of cultural change, or even better, turn back the clock, reimpose authority, tradition, its sanctity on our society. When Trump says, no other leader than me could have overturned Roe v. Wade, I think the implicit message is quite clear, that he is the kind of leader who embraces authority and does so even if the legal niceties of a constitutional democracy suggest that he shouldn't have that amount of authority. He is not going to be restrained in that way by procedure. He is the kind of leader who can reimpose authority. He's already done it with regards to access to abortion. And again, I just want to be as clear as possible. Reimposing tradition in the 21st century is very different from the politics of overturning or upending or coming out from under the confines of tradition in the second half of the 20th century. At that point, people are saying, look, this tradition is primarily carried by us, by our beliefs, by our embrace of our parents' values. We, in fact, no longer want to carry that tradition, no longer want to maintain our parents' gender norms, religious tradition, view of authority, etc. And so that's a matter of changing hearts and minds, right? If we no longer act in that way, then we can change the culture simply by not reproducing the culture voluntarily or organically. By the way, of course, this was aided and abetted by technology, by the ready availability of birth control that was effective, and later the availability of abortion. But it occurs through the voluntary choice of individuals, the upending of tradition. Having said that, if we're going to reimpose tradition in the 21st century, it will have to be coercive, because a large portion, the majority of the population, has said these traditions are no longer what we believe, and we do not want to reproduce them or to be constrained by them. If we're going to reproduce them, we're also going to transform them in the process of reproducing them. And we therefore are clear. We do not regard traditional gender norms and rules and roles as legitimate. We do not regard a society with compulsory heterosexuality as legitimate. By the way, things to do with immigration, with immigrants having to check their identity at the border in order to assimilate into our dominant culture, things to do with race and racial subordination and privilege, have also been challenged in this period. And it's become clear that the majority of the population does not regard all of this regulation as legitimate and rejects it will not continue to reproduce it unless they're coercively forced to do so. And so, what we see in states like Texas, with an effort to jail those who assist women in gaining access to abortion pills, with an effort to criminalize those who would drive a woman across the border to New Mexico to gain access to an abortion. This is indicative of the way in which these new efforts to reimpose tradition require coercion. Now, the new material that it occurs to me is quite relevant to our discussion here. And it's material which many years ago we started to discuss together, but I think it's particularly relevant in this context. There's a contemporary social psychologist at NYU by the name of Jonathan Haidt. And I'm going to focus on a book he published almost a decade ago, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. But I would just point out to you that he's published 2 books and many articles since then. He's been particularly interested in what he calls the coddling of the American mind, the raising of a generation of children who are much less resilient to stress than previous generations of American children have been. And then most recently focusing on social media and what he sees as the harm of social media, especially to young people. But returning to The Righteous Mind, one of the things that Haidt did, and I think it's very interesting, very important work, even if I don't fully agree with every aspect of it, is he suggested that psychologists before him had a fundamental kind of selection bias in the people that they had studied. They work at Western colleges and universities. They have ready access to college students as subjects for their tests, their experiments, their surveys, and they have built their models of human psychology on the basis of the way in which college students perform in these trials and surveys. And the claim that Haidt made is that, in fact, American and Western college students are often quite different from people in other contexts and other societies, that they are what he called weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, and that much of the population of the world doesn't have that background, that background shapes your moral psychology. So having said that, he eventually developed what he called moral foundations. And so these are forms of judgment, of concern, ways of structuring moral judgment that he thinks have a certain content, a certain structure, right? So one kind of judgment we make that we tend to regard as a moral judgment is one that's informed fundamentally by the dichotomy between care and harm. We feel compassion for those who are vulnerable or suffering. We recognize that immediately as a moral judgment. He then adds, well, there's also fairness in cheating. We are concerned that people get what they deserve, what is theirs, what they've earned, what is appropriate. And we are in particular inclined to punish those who try to free ride or try to take something from others that they do not deserve or do not have a right to. We are concerned with liberty and oppression. He came to this category a little bit later in his research. So in general, we resent restrictions on choices and actions, especially when those are perceived to be arbitrary. And if the person who's restricting our choice or action is someone who just does so because they are strong and have the power to do so, we tend to band together to resist their strength, their oppression, their bullying. Many people also consider it to be fundamental to their morality that they differentiate between those with whom they belong or share an identity. Who is the relevant moral us? Showing loyalty to that group and not preferring members of the out group to members of the in group, not doing nice things for them if it damages us, is central to the way in which some people think about morality. And we want to be clear about who is in our group and to express our solidarity with them. Authority and subversion. We value, many of us do, as a central aspect of our morality, the order, the authority, the hierarchy that the norms create. We want to be told by the priest, by the rabbi, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, to have them present at central rituals. And we dislike those who fail to show the appropriate deference and respect. We worry that they might actually undermine the authority that secures order for us, that if they succeed in doing so, that the taken for granted structure of shared norms might be damaged, and that we would be in a much less ordered world as a result. Finally, sanctity and degradation. We have a sense that some things deserve a special kind of treatment, belong to a different order, therefore should not be profaned or degraded by being treated simply as an object of ordinary life. What would you think if somebody took the American flag and used it as their doormat, right? You know, this is what we wipe our muddy boots on. Many people would consider that to be offensive, would consider that to be unpatriotic, but even more so would be a profaning of an object that plays an essential role in our civil religion. And you look at these different categories of moral judgment, and I think many of us might say, well, some of those sound spot on, that they hit a chord, but some of them, they sound a little bit different, a little bit too staid, too traditional, too conservative for me, or maybe too liberal. And so part of what hate has done, having given us the core categories of moral judgment, is then to ask, does each person care the same amount about each of these categories? And his finding is absolutely not. And that in fact, there tend to be very typical divisions between the amount we care about each of these categories, and that our political identities and ideologies tend to map onto our moral psychologies. So he suggests that progressives or liberals tend to be much more concerned with care, liberty, and fairness, right? The first three of these categories, and much less concerned. They play a much smaller role in their moral thinking about loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Whereas conservatives tend to be much more balanced, right? They care not only about care, liberty, and fairness, but also about loyalty, authority, and sanctity, and that libertarians care primarily about liberty and fairness and much less about the other areas. And so part of what hate is saying is that our moral psychology is shaped from a very young age, perhaps even genetically, but certainly by our early socialization, by our internalization of our parents' values. and that once it is shaped, it is stable, and to expect someone to change their moral psychology is a bit like asking them to convert their religion. Yes, some people do it, but it's not something that generally you can argue somebody out of or expect them to simply revise once they're presented with a counter argument. It is much more deeply integrated into our sense of self and identity and into the way in which we process and make sense of the world. So, having said all of that, I hope you can see that a conservative, in Haidt's sense of the term, has a moral psychology that is resistant to rapid cultural change, and that the experience of rapid cultural change for them is not just disconcerting. Why is everything changing so quickly? But in fact, deeply threatening. I'm not sure that I can really make sense of or feel at home in the world that has changed so quickly. I'm not sure what my role is it and in it is anymore. I'm not sure the values, traditions, norms, and roles that make me who I am and make this world make sense to me, make me feel at home in it, are there anymore. And so the feeling of living through a period of rapid social cultural change is assaultive, deeply disorienting, deeply challenging for the people with more conservative moral psychology. And Haidt does, I think, really interesting work, some of it with another social psychologist, a former student of his by the name of Karen Stenner. And I particularly find this work, which I know the diagram doesn't help a lot, but from a recent article published by Stenner and Haidt, looking at 2016 in particular, and looking at three sets of elections: the voting for Donald Trump, the voting for Brexit, for the British withdrawal from the European Union, and the voting for Marine Le Pen in the French national elections. And what they find in each of these cases is that if the person in question is a kind of traditional conservative but does not experience much normative threat from the cultural changes that are occurring in their society, then their likelihood of supporting Brexit, of supporting Le Pen, of supporting Trump is not very high. But if they are the kind of person who is more traditional, who is more threatened by rapid normative change, and if they experience their current historical moment as containing rapid normative change, the likelihood that they're going to vote for Trump goes way up, or for Brexit, or for Le Pen. And to be as clear as possible, I think this supports the idea then that what we're seeing in voting behavior right now is deeply polarized because our moral psychologies are different from each other. And that for many voters, the embrace of rapid cultural change by the left has been more of a problem, more of a reason to vote for the other side than has the embrace of big government or redistributive taxation or high regulations. And so this is shaping our politics. Now, having said all of that, I want to bring the courts back in. This is just to point out again, right, that 43% of Republicans support federal guarantee of a right to abortion. And the reason to focus on them in particular is because I think for the last almost 50 years, they have taken that right for granted. It is protected by the court. It is off the political agenda. We don't have to condition our vote on the candidate's position on this issue because the candidate has no power over this issue. That just changed 180 degrees. And who we vote for in 2024 is likely to have profound consequences on the composition of our federal judiciary, what is and isn't on the political agenda. And I'm going to suggest that this is not just causing the focus on an issue to become more salient, more prominent. I'd better think again about abortion because I can't take it for granted anymore because there's a new Supreme Court and it's not protecting it anymore. That would be to, in a sense, assimilate abortion to other normal political issues. But if some of the voters, right, and please note, it's not just on the Republican side, right? It's 2/3 of independents, obviously, a large majority of Democrats and some critical Democratic constituents, Black women, Democratic women, women in states with abortion with abortion bans, say that abortion is now the most important issue for them. Are they saying to themselves, well, I care about the economy, but I care about abortion a little bit more? Or are they saying something else to themselves, which is, I thought I lived in a society in which equality under the law extended to protecting women's procreative autonomy, because we know this has consequences for women's capacity to get education, to start careers, to pursue those careers, to be equal within their marriages. Do I now need to fight against the Supreme Court to maintain my understanding of the Constitution, of our society, of our freedom and equality within it? And if so, does that, in a sense, put me on a different political track than the ordinary political track in which I just care about these issues because they affect my well-being or what I think of the well-being in my society? If it's that deeper change, if people are really starting to say, uh-oh, I've got to enter the fight on behalf of civil rights again in the 21st century, on behalf of women's rights, on behalf of a federal government able to regulate the economy and protect me because the court is going after these rights. If, right, we look at the fact that the not just Supreme Court, right, which is now has a 6-3 super majority of conservative justices who maintain an originalist stance. You got to read the Constitution the way it was read at the time it was framed or ratified. And that means, right, that 18th century readings of the Constitution are the only viable readings of the Constitution. And that means that all of these cultural changes that we've undergone in the intervening 200 years are irrelevant to the meaning of the Constitution, right? If that's the position of the court, do we have to really focus our politics on saying to the court, no, you've got that wrong. That is our Constitution, not your Constitution. The court is out of step, not just with the transient majority, right? We want the court to come in and cool us down if we get overheated by a temporary bout of political passion. Yes, please do that. But no, we don't want you telling us that the Constitution means something other than what we think it means if we have stably for 50 years told you this is what our Constitution means. That pushes us into a different mode of politics. At least it might. And so appreciating that the current court is radical about abortion, in part because this has been an extremely effective issue for mobilizing conservative voters to support conservative politicians who are going to appoint conservatives to the Supreme Court and the federal bench. Yes, but it's also the case that those conservatives are not just going to overturn abortion and affirmative action, they're also going to potentially radically scale back the administrative state, radically scale back environmental regulation at a time when our planet is potentially threatened, our capacity to sustain biological life on the planet by climate change, radically scale back sane gun regulation when more and more of our children are traumatized by active shooters in their schools or the need to prepare for that eventuality. Dramatically change the role of religion in the state and in education, despite the fact that we have become an increasingly secular post-traditional society. Roll back further the political power of unions, which have already been so beaten back by global economic forces, right? And that this court seems to be headed in the direction of continuing on all of these lines, maybe not quite as fast as the Fifth Circuit wants them to move. But if you look at the Fifth Circuit, which right, Donald Trump had a large number of very conservative appointments to, you begin to see what the federal judiciary would look like under a second Trump presidency, right? It would continue to move in this direction in all of these areas. Are we as a society beginning to say to ourselves, it's not just Donald Trump and what he represents. He has his liabilities. Biden has his liabilities. Are we beginning to say to ourselves, this is our Constitution? We need to not just continue along the normal tracks of politics. We need to begin to rise to the challenge of reasserting popular control over the core meaning of our Constitution. When we do this, Bruce Ackerman of Yale, in this famous series of books, We the People, suggests we enter an entirely different kind of politics, one where the fact that we're focused on constitutional issues pulls out a deeper level of understanding, commitment, deliberation, focus, public spiritedness, one that makes us less inclined to simply say, I'll go where my party takes me. Think again about abortion. For 50 years, moderate Republican women have been saying, well, I don't really like my party's stance on abortion, but I'll go along with it because there's no chance that they're actually going to overturn Roe. Now that Roe has been overturned, do some women recognize that they made a mistake? Do some people begin to say, wait a moment, we're in a epoch of politics where we have to focus not only on the ordinary policy issues, but on the deeper constitutional issues. The fundamental stake of this, and I'm now bringing in somebody we've talked about before, but it's been a while. This is Ronald Dworkin, one of the most influential scholars of constitutional law and jurisprudence of the 20th century, actually into the 21st century. He's been dead for a little bit less than half a decade, and he argued especially in this book life's dominion, but really throughout his career, for what we've come to call a living, as opposed to a frozen constitution, for the idea that the Constitution ultimately contains open-ended, broad moral commitments, that the founders, the framers, the ratifiers deliberately chose that language because it allowed for subsequent generations to do the work of deciding what these principles meant to them. The principles constrain us. They don't allow us to decide. Freedom of speech means that we can put people in jail for saying something that we disagree with, but at the same time, they also require ongoing interpretation. Is objecting to the war in Vietnam because you believe that killing is wrong, not because you're a Quaker, but because your secular philosophical worldview makes you a vegetarian and a pacifist. Is that something that the protection of freedom of religion should be extended to include? On a living constitution view, that's an open question. On an originalist view, if it wasn't part of the discussion in the 18th century, then it can't be part of the discussion in the 20th and 21st century. And so Dworkin's view of the Constitution, I think, became the dominant view of the Constitution, and it's not an accident. Dworkin was reflecting in jurisprudence the sentiment of Earl Warren and others on the court, but the sentiment of many people in his society at his historical moment. Have we surrendered the idea of a living constitution? If so, are we comfortable with the court, in a sense, turning the clock back 100 or more years on what the Constitution means? I will just point out to you very briefly that in the period in which the court has been remade to be a much more conservative institution, it has also become a much more obviously political and partisan institution. Dworkin coined this phrase that the court should be a forum of principle. The principle it should decide is constitutional and not political or partisan, right? The idea that the Constitution contains core moral principles that we should be able to agree on, although we have to determine how to interpret them, is not a partisan enterprise. But over the last 20 odd years, we've moved away from a court that is fairly unanimous and in the direction of a court that is often quite polarized. That in that same period, the number of people who disapprove of the court and who regard the court as a partisan institution has grown. We add to that, and this will be the last thing I'll just introduce today, that the idea of originalism doesn't just seem to be unpopular, doesn't just seem to remove the capacity of the people to control the interpretation of the Constitution so that it comports with their values, their understandings, their sovereignty over the Constitution. It does appear, frankly, to be incoherent, right? This is Erwin Chemerinsky in the news right now because there was a protest at his house during a graduation celebration at UC Berkeley's law school. But he's written this book, which I think is a very good book, Worse Than Nothing: The Dangerous Fallacy of Originalism. And so one question is, right, if you believe originalism, then you believe the framers intended to bind future generations, right? Do we have any evidence that that was their intention? And we go back and we look at Madison and Hamilton and Jay and Jefferson and Adams, and we seem to see very little evidence that their assumption was that subsequent generations would have to believe that the Constitution meant exactly what they thought it meant. And that's in part because the Constitution claimed authority and legitimacy on the basis of the idea that it spoke for we the people, not we the people of a certain decade or historical moment, but we the people as an ongoing project of maintaining popular sovereignty over our Constitution. As the people change over time, so too should the Constitution. And by the way, the Supreme Court's role in interpreting the Constitution is one of the most effective ways of maintaining continuity while accommodating change within the reading, the meaning, the interpretation of the Constitution. By the way, if you look back at the Constitutional Convention, the idea, as far as we can tell based on the notes of those who were there, that the framers had a singular intention or meaning behind the Constitution falls apart immediately, right? These were compromises between people who very often had sharp disagreements. And the idea that that meaning, if there was a singular intent or meaning, can be historically reconstructed, that we can get inside their heads and figure out exactly why they did what they did, also seems to be a non-starter. And so all of this to say, we have a court that appears to be using a standard for interpretation that is deeply flawed and using it in part to justify their own supremacy over the Constitution, which violates the idea of popular sovereignty. Are we beginning to see people awakening to the threat to their understanding of their rights, of their understanding of the role they want the federal government to play? If so, is this potentially driving a deeper change in our politics? I would point out to you that most people thought that 2022 would be a red wave election, right? That the Republicans would trounce the Democrats because the Democrats were saddled with an unpopular president who had, in a sense, been very aggressive in his use of his very narrow majority to get a whole bunch of legislation passed, the kind of thing that happened to Obama in his first midterm elections. And lo and behold, that didn't happen. One explanation would be that Trump is just not that popular. But I think a second and perhaps more interesting, more provocative explanation is that we're beginning to transition into a different mode of politics, and that our polling and our past elections don't capture this very well, but more people, because of abortion, but in general because of the radicalism of the current court, are beginning to say, I can't just fall in line with my party and the ordinary issues that I care about. I have to rethink my political stance. I think that's happening with abortion, but I think it may be happening a little bit more broadly too. All right, so that's the bigger picture issue I've been driving at with this connected series on abortion, sexuality, and gender. Curious to hear, now that in a sense you've got all of my cards on the table, what you think. Anybody want to start us out? Question, comment, thought, disagreement? I want to hear what you have to say. I'm not seeing anybody raising their hand. Please just go ahead and unmute yourself, push your space bar down if you want to talk.
David? It's Anne.
Yes. Hi, Anne. Go ahead.
I'd be Flossie, and
yeah, we've changed the batting order today, right?
Yeah, I think that last statement that you were raising, that people are beginning to think not about the abortion issue, but the Supreme Court issue and how it behaves or what kind of a thing is. And that really struck home with me. I hadn't put it in those terms, but I think that, and hopefully people are aware of the power now of the Supreme Court and how it can affect all aspects of our lives, not just one.
Yeah, thank you for that, Anne. And I've pointed out in the past, I'll just reiterate, the courts and politics are interconnected in the 2024 election in a way that I don't think they have been for a very long time, if ever before, in American politics, right? So Donald Trump is going to start his first criminal prosecution next week. That's going to call attention to the intersection of the court and politics. But the Supreme Court in particular, right, may be the most functional institution in the federal government right now, in part because in order to win in the Supreme Court, all you have to do is count to 5. And they've got a clear, stable majority that does not have to stand for re-election, but in part because the procedural encumbrance of Congress, right? The filibuster rule in the Senate, the holds in the Senate, the Hassert rule in the House, none of that applies to the Supreme Court. They are able to act decisively and with tremendous concentrated power and not have to pay any electoral consequence if their action is unpopular. And so, yes, I do think we're beginning to awaken to the fact, I at least that's my hypothesis. I guess we'll have to see that we might have a court that believes very different things about the Constitution than many of us believe, and that the project of reasserting our control over the Constitution via disciplining the court is a very different political project than the ordinary project of just making up our minds who we're going to vote for. All right, so batting second today, Flossie Lewis. Go ahead, Flossie.
I worry about not the people who are thinking. As long as we're thinking, we're questioning, and when it comes to voting, we will do the right thing. I worry about that portion of a population that doesn't give a damn, that lives each day as it comes, and who will not think, and who do not care. And they are a good portion of our population. As long as we think, we will do the right thing. For those who refuse to think, all I can do is pray.
Well, I guess part of what I'm trying to suggest is that these moments, right, and the historiography is very interesting on this issue, when we enter a constitutional track of politics, and I think the abortion issue is really helpful to think about this, right? So you have, and let's focus for a minute on suburban white women, right? Pretty important force in American electoral politics for much of the last 40 years, that they have thought to themselves, it's okay to vote for Republicans because they can't take away things that matter to me and my daughter and my standing in this society. And you know, I have some cousins, for instance, who are white Republican suburban women. And although I don't agree with them on their politics, they're quite empowered, successful, professional people. And I think that they may be beginning to question, wait a sec, why am I voting this way? If I continue to vote this way, is it going to damage my daughters? Are they not going to be able to do with their lives what I did with my life? And so, yes, there's always a large portion of the population for whom politics is an afterthought. And obviously, we get together every Saturday morning to talk about this stuff. We're people who care about this, right? And think about it and want to be stimulated and critical and questioning and analytical about it. And of course, we're a minority in this regard. But sometimes circumstances lead you to be more thoughtful, that it's hard to avoid playing out the question, what should I do? Right? Should I just continue down the track I've been on for a long time? Or if I continue down that track, is there a real danger that my society is going to be a very different place than the place I think it is, and that the people I love are not going to have the same opportunities, the same rights, the same liberty that I've had? I think that might prompt deeper thinking. That's what Bruce Ackerman thinks as well. Thank you, Flossie. It's a good way to tie some of these themes together. Anybody else with a thought or a question for today? All right. So take care. Good being with you as always. And I will see everybody next week. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.